Hello, and welcome to the Branching PathCast. I'm Marley, and today I want to discuss how ownership, identity, and perception alter how we understand and make sense of the world. At a loss for words? Stick around. There are many desires and aversions that help drive behavior of people, both in games and throughout our lives. Not too long ago, a field called positive psychology was enjoying popular attention, and one of the tenets underlying it is that positivity is a powerful force. That desire or motivation towards a goal is effective and beneficial to foster. And cognitive behavioral therapy and many philosophies focus on the reframing of things to be perceived in a broader context or different light. When I think about the judgmental axis running from negativity to positivity, I picture my endeavors framed as attempting to nudge the current point along the axis from negative to neutral and neutral to positive. But there is also this idea that negativity may be used to effectively motivate people. This can be seen in many scenarios and is often referenced as a carrot and a stick. The idea being in this scenario, I would enjoy eating a carrot, which is absurd. But desire and aversion is something interesting, and things like Stoicism and Buddhism take an interesting stance on this axis and where one ought lie on it. And we'll revisit that in a short while, but I would like to delve deeper into how desire and aversion impact games and how people relate to them. Items hold a pivotal role in story-driven games. I would like to explore the idea that equipment is compelling, past the discussion of it being a measuring stick for progression and gained competence. In movies, it is fairly common to start in media res. It is difficult to hook people and make them care about what is going on at the start of the film, as the introduction of the main characters and life, as it currently is, can be relatively unengaging, and the introduction of something to make the audience care early on is more difficult than when they get to know the character, flaws, relationships, and drives. Beginning with an exciting part in the middle or end of the film, it allows for an injection of action, drama, and intrigue that is not generally comparable with starting at the beginning of the story. This pacing and the introduction of heightened conflict, stakes, and non sequiturs in want of resolution keep the audience engaged, and with growing alternatives vying for time and the normalization of multitasking, it is becoming more appealing to go with this kind of approach. This has been happening in games for a long time as well, and there were several memorable instances where the beginning of an RPG saw the player control a collection of legendary heroes, armed to the teeth, and possessing stats and equipment the likes of which you will not see again for at least the duration of a week of working an actual job. You guide them, laying waste to indomitable creatures and destroying a being of unfathomable power with ease. Is this any different from a movie using the same techniques? In several important ways, it is. This experience lends a stark contrast to what you will actually be doing for the majority of a well-balanced RPG, which is struggling and grinding. The sharp contrast between the immense power of the opening characters and the incompetence of the protagonist is impactful in a way that is hard to get across in movies. But it is not felt as a great removal of power or reduction. It is interpreted as a promise, the setting of an expectation. Beyond the cinematic equivalence of danger, drama, and mystery that this allows, it is a contract with the player that if you continue down this path, here's what lies at the end of it. Why does this feel different from having the same thing happen to you after 40 hours of being on the journey with those characters? There are many times where games will take away equipment and items. However, the majority of the time it is temporary. The false beginning, where you have legendary heroes with amazing equipment, is not overly satisfying, and the sudden loss of them is not devastating. There is not a sense of felt ownership or connection to the progress, items, and characters. There is nothing lost. Much of the fun of an RPG is to progress and accrue. The fun is in the journey, and not in the destination. If that is true, why does it feel so awful if an incredible piece of gear is destroyed? Isn't it that this just prolongs the journey? There is a sense that something has been taken from you, something that you earned, and many players will recoil at this. Generally, the human brain is wired to amplify negative stimuli relative to an equal input of positive stimuli. The idea of losing something you have, even if you are gaining something fairly equivalent or even better, has been shown in many experiments to be strong. People are extremely averse to the notion that something that is theirs is lost. The idea that people losing progress in the form of equipment loss would be deterring, or the reluctance to exchange an item for a modest benefit, is kind of strange if we think about the prolonging of an experience being just more of the experience, which is supposed to be enjoyable. In this case, it makes sense that the feeling of going backwards is irritating, and it is easy to see how this may feel unfair. The violation of an implicit contract, the backwards progression, may invalidate the expectations and make the experience feel redundant and punishing rather than like progression. That is not the case for all games, however. Some games do offer a rewarding experience through their iterative progression, yet most games will not dare take away equipment and experiences earned. Here, there lies an important clue. The idea of something being earned and a projected ownership onto the experience and the equipment. When there is an item that you earn after a quest, there is increased amounts of sunk cost involved, from time and energy, both strategic and emotional, that may be associated with the gains. I don't recall where I heard it, but there's an idea that the majority of associated thoughts we have with something is not about the thing itself, but projections and subjective and relational meaning about the thing. So when your attention is turned to a vase in the house, there are many different thoughts that come attached to it. Maybe it is not that important, and you would not mind it being destroyed or sold. Maybe it is just a container for soil to host vegetation. But maybe it's part of a set by an artist you admire, or representative of generations of your family. Maybe it was made by a close friend and holds symbolic meaning of your friendship in that way. Or the illustrations on the vase speak of something ineffable inside of you. Or running your hand along the side of it, your fingers travel across the crack after your old dog kicked it over while threatening a rabbit outside. That is anchored to that memory. So the meaning of objects is often varied and complicated based on how we tend to connect and associate things. After gaining an item, an associative and evaluative process takes place, taking in many factors to assign a value to it. There is certainly functional weight, and how it compares to the previously wielded item. The difference in stats and abilities afforded are important. This depends on the individual, the type of game, and the context of the accrual. If it was only a numbers game, and it is to some people, there is often no reason to keep something when it is swapped out for another piece of equipment. But often, I will keep things long past their utility, or use things that are lesser, even though I know it does not serve me mechanically. Besides the surface level mathematical evaluation, the story attached to it, or the amount of time taken to gain the item is of great relevance. The rarity of something is definitely a huge factor as well. There may be an extremely expensive item that you can only get in one shop, and that item may be sought after, but it will not have the same meaning as an extremely rare drop, which far fewer people will have the ability to get. As well, there is the added circumstance that one is inevitable, while another is probabilistic. The combination of chance and rarity is a powerful way to assign value and meaning to something. When it becomes uncertain if you will ever reach your objective, then there is usually a lot more effort that is framed as working towards that goal. There's also a distinct difference in the obscuring of progression. Where you can track your progress towards a storefront purchase, there is no knowing if you will ever be blessed with a rare drop. All you may do is put your trust in the process and do the work. The difficulty obtaining the objective and the rarity make it valuable because there is social meaning behind it. It becomes a distinction linked to you that you may share with others, and although it does not have a large impact on the game experience overall, this kind of thing can easily become more engaging than the bulk of the content. There are more ways in which meaning is associated with the equipment, progress, and value, and I will explore them more in the future. But veering back towards the idea of why it is often the case that games are loath to introduce mechanics that take away objects in games can now be further explored. It now makes more sense why it may be recoiled against when something earned is lost. People will circumvent these kinds of things many ways, such as save scumming, duplication, and other such behaviors. If a consumable is valuable or too rare and beneficial, it may be preserved in the inventory until the end of the game, making it functionally useless. Besides the stereotypical protagonist being a callous psychopath, most have a terrible hoarding compulsion. Storage containers brimming with loot representative of the journey. This may serve as trophies, which may be visited to relive the associated meaning. When things feel earned and become something that is owed to the player, the denial of that can be repulsive. Setbacks of this nature often occur in life, and part of the most implicit contracts in games is that your work will not be undermined, and your progress is guaranteed, so long as you put in the effort. A violation of this expectation can make the player disengage from the game completely. Art mimics life mimics art, and habitual or familiar things train our mind to more readily accept or engage in similar behavioral patterns, or to be more open to like content. The evaluation of equipment with ownership and the idea that we are owed something is interesting, and the continual set expectation and satisfying of performing the task and receiving the reward of never going backwards is interesting. What would it be like for a game to challenge the player in that space? I know that I have barriers in my life where if I perceive something as a step backwards, I'm very resistant to it. All that is in my way is my perception of things and nothing more. You have gone through a quest line, and you have received a coveted item. The time sunk into gaining it and the story behind it are used to attach great significance to it within the game space. It is affording you great benefit compared to your previously used correlate. After a short time, there is an enemy that takes it and destroys it. This is the only one in existence. There can be a great sense of bitterness in the feeling that it was not fair. We can look at this again from a distance. You began not having the item. Then you participated in the game space, performing actions, and attained it. After a while, you no longer had it again. So you could say that, in some sense, you started in one state where you were content. You moved on to another state in which you felt a rush in accomplishing a task and getting an item. The loss of that item has left you in the state you were previously, in some sense, except for you are no longer satisfied. Having been somewhere you considered better, this is no longer an acceptable state. It is not fair to be taken backwards. What has changed is nothing but the perception of the situation. The attachment, felt ownership, and entitlement of the thing is what is not acceptable. Having never had it and carried on, it would have felt better than to have had it briefly and then had it taken away. This is interesting, given it seems like it would be better to enjoy something briefly than to never have had the experience at all. Many people play games as a form of enjoyment and escapism, and it is undoubtedly easier to make games that make players feel good and do not challenge them in this way. But I would say this is an opportunity to challenge game design practices and explore different ways of playing within the design space. There are good examples that do make use of loss in games. Shadow of Mordor is influenced by roguelikes, and there's a procedural generation that runs the items you get. The constant battling of rivals helps lend significance to some of the drops. You could be fighting a long-lasting rival, and striking them down for the final time, get a spun-up item that is serendipitously suitable for the occasion. Most of the time, your generated items are not likely to be meaningful, and just be swapped out as the situation merits. This game is not so much about the attainment of these items, and more about the situational ability that things afford. The similar items are generally infinite in practicality, and these factors help to diminish the loss in processing now not useful items for component parts. And the main driver is the relationship flux of the different parties, the emergent stories, and the continual progress through regional access and control. But there are some rivals that, upon defeating you, will take your wielded item and destroy it in front of you. This is an instance that feels very rewarding, as the driving force of the experience is the ebb and flow of aggression between the parties. It is really fun and motivating to have your rival cut you down and disrespect you like this. The grudge formed and retribution sought make things more interesting, and the design of this game makes it an additive experience. Roguelikes also use utter loss as a core mechanic. It is generally extremely easy for people to lose everything in an instant, sometimes due to no fault of their own. In playing Tales of Magiel, I would sink hours and hours into a character and then simply come across something I was in no way equipped to deal with. Having no recourse, I would have my carefully crafted character and procedurally differentiated items destroyed. This is extremely brutal at times, when you have a really good run and you suffer a defeat that erases so much of your time and effort, rendering it moot. But the attempt to try again, with a new path unfolding, a new approach, and a new set of circumstances and equipment to try, it is about the experience of navigating within the context to the best of your ability and pushing against the incredible odds. Pixel Dungeon is another good example of a well-balanced roguelike, and Fatal Labyrinth, which I love. Fatal Labyrinth had checkpoints, where I believe every 5 levels you could restart, and it was usually more disheartening to begin a few levels back than to restore completely. This was interesting, as you would think choosing to start from scratch would be less desirable than to lose only a few levels worth of progress. I have found that it feels much worse to start from a previous point than to try all over again, and it may be specific to how my mind works, but I would rather quit entirely than start a few levels back. The continuity is broken, and it feels like carrying on from that point is somehow in bad faith. There is no feeling of revenge, and what can be engaging and comfortable has become burdensome and vexing, due only to the fact that I was further along, and now I am not. What I had was taken away, and now I am dissatisfied with what I have and with where I am. It has been interesting to see the progress of incorporating roguelike loss and the different ways these outcomes were softened and confined. Spelunky was one of the more popular games that brought roguelike loss mechanics to the forefront of its design. Exploring the procedural rooms was engaging, and the fun was in how punishing it was, with the never-ending mix-ups skewering your best efforts in unforgiving ways. But this too has different ways to reward progression while remaining punishing. The items are not unique, and so it does not feel extremely negative to lose them. The lost progress of a good run is brutal, but the variety of each experience makes it compelling to continue on, and the ability to unlock zones and characters give a way of providing progress and avoiding complete loss as you go. The currency of these kinds of games is really experience, and each brutal death becomes a valuable learning experience which helps to make it cathartic rather than grave. Rogue Legacy has also implemented a similar, although more robust solution to their roguelike mechanics, with an overarching upgrades system that takes place between each run. It allows for players to not feel completely distraught at the death of their character. It is built firmly into the core loop, and the resources feed into the concurrent runs, which allows for the fun of roguelike randomness and brutality while also affording the forward progression over time. This deft combination and creative framing has made it one of the more impressive games overall in my eyes. How loss of progression in any sense is handled is an important consideration in the overall design of your game. The mechanical implementation, the place it holds within the core game loop, the framing and presentation of it, the rarity and certainty of the progress, and surely other factors still all come together to contribute to the overall experience of loss in games, or even if something is felt as a loss at all. I am reminded finally of an anecdote from the World of Warcraft system that I believe is fairly popular. I'm sure it was from crack.com article or something. It was discussing the mechanical implementation of a system that encouraged people to play in shorter bursts rather than for prolonged periods of time. It was initially implemented as a penalty whereby after a fixed duration, there would be a cooldown where you could receive less experience points than you normally would. This was met with extreme backlash from the community. When considering how to respond to this outcry from the community, the design team came up with a creative reframe for their mechanic. They released a patch, and now after you rested for a short time, you were rewarded at the start by receiving bonus experience for a duration of time afterwards, and then you would need to rest again to receive that perk. This is one of the many amazing WoW development stories that I feel is extremely informative in how things are designed. The system was the exact same. It was only the reframing of the system that changed, and this made all the difference between something that the community was riotous towards to something that the community welcomed with open arms and celebrated. This is the power of reframing, and a great example of loss aversion. I have managed to meander all over the place. To be transparent, I'm learning as I go, and I'm prioritizing releasing anything rather than releasing things that are extremely tight. And my articles will be more clear-cut, but I would be grateful if you listened to my podcast and read my articles as well. So this has been the Branching PathCast, episode 4. I'm Marley, and I hope to see you next week. Please subscribe to be kept up to date and to support my endeavors. There should be a link in the description if you would like to send me feedback in a way similar to texting. Feel free to check out branchingpath.com where you can read articles and find my email if you prefer that method of communication. Thank you so much. Take care.